When governments vanish, warlords rise, and he became the king of heroin. Born Chang Chi-fu on February 17, 1934, in the remote village of Loi Ma in Mong Yai State, Myanmar, his destiny was written in the mountains long before he could read it. His father was Chinese, a merchant who had crossed into Burma seeking fortune. His mother was Shan, a member of the ethnic minority that had inhabited these misty highlands for centuries, long before colonial maps carved artificial borders through their ancestral lands. The boy grew up in a world where sovereignty was an illusion. The British Empire had collapsed, leaving behind a power vacuum that no single force could fill. The newly independent Burmese government in Rangoon was distant, corrupt, and hostile to ethnic minorities. The mountains of Shan State became a no-man's land, where survival meant choosing sides, or creating your own. Poverty was not merely economic, it was existential. Villages like Loi Ma existed on the margins of history, forgotten by kings and presidents alike. The land was fertile, but what grew best was neither rice nor tea. It was the poppy, beautiful, deadly, and infinitely profitable. For generations, Shan farmers had cultivated opium for medicinal use and local trade. But after World War II, everything changed. The Golden Triangle, where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand converged, became the new frontier of global narcotics. Young Chang Chi-fu did not attend school. There were no schools. Instead, he learned the language of violence. At age 12, he joined a local militia. At 14, he carried a rifle taller than himself. At 16, he commanded men twice his age. He was not exceptional because of genius or cruelty. He was exceptional because he understood the fundamental law of the jungle. Power is the only currency that matters. In his late teens, he took the name Khun Sa, which means Prince Prosperous in Shan. It was a declaration, a prophecy, and a warning. The boy from Loi Ma was dead. In his place stood a warlord. Khun Sa's ascent began not in defiance of the state, but in partnership with it. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Burmese military government faced a chaotic landscape of insurgencies. Communist rebels, ethnic militias, and remnants of the Chinese Kuomintang, who had fled Mao's revolution, carved out their own territories. The government, desperate and outgunned, turned to an old strategy: fight fire with fire. They enlisted local warlords to fight the rebels. These were called the Kakweye militias, unofficial paramilitary forces with official backing. Khun Sa became one of them. His mission was simple: suppress communist insurgents and Shan separatists. His payment was even simpler: control over opium production and trafficking routes. The government looked the other way, as long as Khun Sa kept the peace. But Khun Sa was never content to be a pawn. By the mid-1960s, he had built his own private army. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of soldiers. He called it the Shan United Army. To the outside world, it looked like a revolutionary force fighting for Shan independence. To rival drug lords, it was a heavily armed cartel. To the farmers of Shan State, it was protection from Burmese soldiers who raped, pillaged, and burned villages suspected of harboring rebels. The SUA was disciplined, well-armed, and fiercely loyal. Khun Sa paid his soldiers regularly, something the Burmese army often failed to do. He provided food, medicine, and a sense of purpose. He gave them not just wages, but identity. They were not bandits. They were soldiers of the Shan people. But behind the rhetoric of liberation lay a darker truth. The SUA's lifeblood was opium. Khun Sa controlled vast swaths of poppy fields. Farmers were given a choice: sell to him at fixed prices or face consequences. He protected them from rival warlords and government raids, but in return, he owned the supply chain. The fields of the Golden Triangle became his kingdom, and opium was his crown. By the end of the 1960s, Khun Sa was no longer just a militia leader. He was a warlord, a businessman, and a politician. He negotiated with Thai generals, bribed Burmese officials, and outmaneuvered rivals with a combination of violence and cunning. His name became synonymous with power in the Golden Triangle. The 1970s marked the golden age of Khun Sa's empire. The global demand for heroin exploded. The Vietnam War had created a generation of addicts among American soldiers. Back in the United States, heroin flooded the streets of New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. And much of it, some estimates said half, originated in the Golden Triangle, under Khun Sa's control. His operation was staggering in scale. Convoys of mules carried raw opium from highland poppy fields to hidden jungle refineries, where chemists, many trained in Hong Kong or Thailand, converted it into heroin. From there, the white powder traveled along ancient smuggling routes, across rivers, through mountain passes, into Thailand, and onward to Hong Kong, the gateway to the world. Khun Sa's genius was not just in production, but in logistics and diplomacy. He maintained relationships with Thai military officers, who allowed his caravans safe passage in exchange for bribes. He paid off Burmese border guards, who turned blind eyes to trucks loaded with narcotics. He negotiated with Chinese syndicates in Hong Kong and Bangkok, who distributed his product globally. He was not merely a trafficker, he was the CEO of a multinational criminal enterprise. At his peak, Khun Sa's annual heroin revenue was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Some reports suggested his organization moved over 600 tons of opium annually. His wealth was legendary. He owned fleets of vehicles, helicopters, and enough weapons to equip a small national army. His jungle fortress, Ban Hin Taek in Thailand, became a miniature state within a state, complete with barracks, hospitals, schools, and even a hotel. Yet Khun Sa maintained a calculated ambiguity about his empire. In interviews, and he gave many, courting journalists with the flair of a politician, he insisted he was not a drug lord, but a freedom fighter. He claimed the opium trade was forced upon him by circumstance. "The Shan people have no other economy," he said. "We grow opium because we have no choice. If the world wants to stop the drug trade, give us an alternative." It was a brilliant narrative. To Western audiences, he was a villain. To Shan villagers, he was a protector. To rival warlords, he was a threat. To governments, he was an embarrassment. Khun Sa ruled his empire with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. His enemies did not simply disappear, they vanished spectacularly. Rival drug lords who challenged his dominance were ambushed on jungle roads, their bodies left as warnings. Villages that refused to cooperate found themselves visited by SUA soldiers, who burned homes and executed headmen in public squares. Informants were hunted down, tortured, and killed. Yet to those who submitted, Khun Sa was a benefactor. He built schools where none existed. He funded roads that connected isolated villages to the outside world. He established clinics and paid for doctors. He gave jobs to thousands, not just soldiers, but porters, guards, farmers, cooks, and administrators. For people who had been ignored by every government that had ever claimed to rule them, Khun Sa was the first leader who seemed to care. This duality was central to his power. Fear kept rivals in check. Loyalty kept his empire stable. He understood that terror alone could not sustain an empire. He needed legitimacy. And so he cultivated an image of himself as a Shan nationalist, a man fighting not for profit, but for his people's freedom. He gave speeches about Shan independence. He met with ethnic leaders and intellectuals. He funded cultural festivals and Buddhist temples. He presented himself as a statesman, not a gangster. And many believed him, or at least wanted to. But beneath the rhetoric, the calculus was always the same. Opium was the foundation of everything. Without it, there would be no schools, no roads, no hospitals, no army. Khun Sa knew this. His critics knew this. But for the farmers and soldiers who depended on him, it didn't matter. He was the only game in town. By the early 1980s, Khun Sa had become a household name in Washington. The Reagan administration, waging its war on drugs, needed a villain, and Khun Sa fit the role perfectly. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration labeled him the most dangerous drug trafficker in the world. In 1989, the United States placed a $2 million bounty on his head, the largest drug-related bounty at the time. But catching Khun Sa was another matter. He operated in one of the most inaccessible regions on Earth. The jungles of Shan State were a labyrinth of mountains, rivers, and hidden trails. The Burmese government, officially allied with the DEA, was either unwilling or unable to act. Thai authorities, many of whom were on Khun Sa's payroll, turned a blind eye, and Khun Sa himself seemed to revel in his notoriety. From his fortress at Ban Hin Taek, he held press conferences, inviting foreign journalists into his domain. He spoke fluent Mandarin, Shan, Burmese, and enough English to charm reporters. He posed for photographs in military fatigues, surrounded by armed guards, looking every bit the revolutionary general. In one infamous interview, he challenged the DEA to come and get him. "I am here," he said, smiling. "If they want me, I am not hiding." It was a taunt, a dare, and a statement of invincibility. The United States had toppled governments, invaded countries, and hunted terrorists across continents. But Khun Sa remained untouchable, a phantom in plain sight. The DEA launched operations. They trained Burmese soldiers. They pressured Thailand to crack down. They tried to infiltrate his network. Nothing worked. Khun Sa's intelligence network was too good, his bribes too generous, his soldiers too loyal. Every time agents thought they were close, he slipped away. By the early 1990s, the United States had poured millions of dollars into efforts to capture Khun Sa. They had nothing to show for it. Empires do not fall from external pressure alone, they collapse from within. And Khun Sa's empire was no exception. By the mid-1990s, cracks had begun to show. Rival warlords, emboldened by his aging and the shifting political landscape, challenged his dominance. The United Wa State Army, a powerful ethnic militia backed by China, emerged as a new force in the opium trade. They were younger, more ruthless, and had better weapons. Meanwhile, the Burmese military government, now calling itself the State Law and Order Restoration Council, saw an opportunity. For years, they had fought Khun Sa's forces, but now they offered him a deal: surrender and live, refuse and die. In 1969, Khun Sa had been arrested once before, charged with treason for attempting to negotiate with Shan rebels. His followers had kidnapped 2 Soviet doctors in 1973 to secure his release, a daring operation that worked. But this time, there would be no rescue. He was surrounded, outgunned, and running out of options. On January 5, 1996, Khun Sa made his choice. He surrendered to the Burmese government. But this was no ordinary surrender. He negotiated terms. He would not be tried for drug trafficking. He would not be extradited to the United States. He would not go to prison. Instead, he would retire. The Shan United Army would be dissolved. His soldiers would be absorbed into the Burmese military or given amnesty. And Khun Sa himself would move to Yangon, formerly Rangoon, where he would live freely, his fortune intact. It was an astonishing deal, one that enraged the DEA and baffled international observers. How could the world's most wanted drug lord simply walk away? The answer lay in Myanmar's murky politics. The military junta needed Khun Sa's surrender to claim a propaganda victory. They also feared that capturing him by force would destabilize Shan state even further. And Khun Sa, ever the pragmatist, understood that the game was over. Better to live in luxury than die in the jungle. For the next decade, Khun Sa lived a life of quiet opulence in Yangon. He invested his fortune in legitimate businesses, hotels, construction companies, transportation networks. He bought properties in Yangon, Mandalay, and Taungyi. He lived in a mansion, surrounded by family, bodyguards, and the trappings of wealth. He was never arrested. The United States demanded his extradition, but Myanmar refused. The DEA fumed. Human rights groups protested, but Khun Sa remained untouchable, protected by the same government that had once fought him. He gave no more interviews. He avoided the public eye. He lived like a retired businessman, playing golf, attending Buddhist ceremonies, and enjoying his grandchildren. The man who had once commanded an army of 20,000 soldiers now spent his days in comfortable obscurity. To the outside world, it was an outrage. To those who understood Myanmar's politics, it was perfectly logical. Khun Sa had been useful. He had surrendered without bloodshed. And in a country where power was negotiated behind closed doors, past sins could be forgiven if you had enough money and influence. On October 26, 2007, Khun Sa died in Yangon at the age of 73. The cause of death was reported as complications from diabetes and high blood pressure. He was cremated in a private Buddhist ceremony, attended by family and a few close associates. There was no trial, no prison, no justice, at least not in the conventional sense. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of the Golden Triangle's drug trade. Other warlords rose to take his place. The UWSA became the dominant force in opium and methamphetamine production. The trade routes remained. The corruption persisted. The addiction continued. Khun Sa's legacy is complex. To some, he was a monster who flooded the world with heroin, destroying countless lives. To others, he was a freedom fighter who protected the Shan people from a brutal military regime. To historians, he was a product of his time, a man who exploited chaos and built an empire from smoke. He called himself a liberator. The world called him a criminal, but history remembers him as what he truly was, an opium king who built an empire out of smoke and disappeared into silence before justice could ever find him. The Golden Triangle still exists. Opium production has declined, but methamphetamine has replaced it. Ethnic militias still control vast territories. Corruption still runs deep, and the ghosts of men like Khun Sa still haunt the mountains. In Shan State, some remember him as a hero, others remember him as a tyrant, but all remember him as a king, because in a land without law, the man with the most guns and the most opium becomes royalty. And Khun Sa, the Prince Prosperous, wore that crown until the very end.